Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Wednesday, October 1st, 2025. All right, so we have a whole bunch of stuff to get through today. The first story at the top of antiwar.com, U.S. officials intensify push to oust Maduro. So senior Trump administration officials have intensified their push to remove Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro from power, and they are discussing steps to escalate the military pressure, and this was reported by the New York Times on Monday. The report said the effort is being led by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who, this is something that I forgot. Rubio is also Trump's national security advisor, and that's been the case since Mike Waltz was pushed out and moved over to the UN. I completely forgot that Rubio was acting in both positions until I read this New York Times article, which mentioned it. So other top officials on board for regime change in Venezuela include CIA Director John Ratcliffe and Stephen Miller, Trump's chief domestic policy advisor. The report cited Venezuelan opposition figures who say that their movement has been planning what to do if Maduro is ousted, and that Rubio had met with 5 opposition figures who fled to the U.S. back in May. During the first Trump administration, the U.S. backed a failed coup attempt against Maduro, led by opposition figure Juan Guaido. This is a picture of Rubio and Ratcliffe having a nice time together at the White House a few weeks ago. So other Trump officials, most notably Special Envoy Rick Grenell, are pushing for diplomacy with Venezuela, and Maduro has sent a letter to Trump seeking talks, although that letter was dismissed by the White House. The press secretary said basically that they ignored the letter. So Venezuela's Foreign Minister Ivan Gil pointed to the fact that his country continues to accept twice weekly deportation flights from the U.S., as a sign that Venezuela is serious about diplomacy. He also said that a war would lead to excessive migration and economic collapse that would destabilize the entire region. One thing during the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, they imposed the very heavy sanctions on Venezuela in 2019 was when they really ramped them up. Excuse me. And 2017 they started ramping them up, and then 2019 they put a whole bunch more on. But when they did that, they knew that it was going to cause, further economic collapse in Venezuela and lead to a migration crisis. But they did it anyway. So officials told the New York Times that the administration is considering launching direct strikes inside Venezuela. And this is something, as we've been covering, that's been reported by multiple other media outlets. And, they're saying that they're going to strike alleged drug cartel targets, but they're also claiming that Maduro is a cartel leader, which means he's a potential target. I mean, they have the pretext all lined up here. And Maduro and other Venezuelan officials, in their defending themselves from the U.S. allegations, have pointed to data that shows the majority of the cocaine that is produced in Colombia does not go through Venezuela. President Trump has framed the military campaign in the region as a response to overdose deaths in the United States due to fentanyl, but fentanyl does not come from Venezuela, and it does not go through Venezuela. This is about cocaine trafficking. So this is things seem to be really heating up and moving closer to the U.S. bombing Venezuela. All right, so the next one here, U.S. Gaza plan includes Netanyahu's edits. So the Gaza ceasefire proposal released by the White House on Monday included significant changes that were requested by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. This was reported by Axios, and then the Times of Israel also had a report that said Netanyahu was able to secure key changes to the proposal during a meeting on Sunday with U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff and his top advisor, Jared Kushner. According to Axios, the release of the deal with Netanyahu's changes, infuriated Arab officials involved in the negotiations. So it was different from what Trump and the Arab leaders had agreed to before. So at a press conference with Netanyahu, President Trump presented his proposal as something that's been widely accepted by the Arab countries, though the deal was, as I said, significantly different than what the Arabs actually agreed to. And the changes were related to two of the most sensitive issues in the negotiations: the disarmament of Hamas and Israel's withdrawal from Gaza. The new proposal ties Israel's phased withdrawal from territory to the demilitarization of Gaza and the ability of an international force to take over the land. The proposal also essentially gives Israel and the U.S. a veto over the withdrawal from Gaza by stating that the IDF will, quote, withdraw based on standard milestones and timeframes linked to demilitarization that will be agreed upon because the IDF, ISF, the guarantors, and the U.S., end quote. According to the Times of Israel, the initial proposal approved by the Arab countries simply stated that the IDF will progressively hand over the Gaza territory that it occupies. Even after all these conditions are met for the withdrawal, the new proposal will allow Israel to occupy a perimeter zone until Gaza is properly secure from any resurgent terror threat. That's the language that is in the proposal. So this language could be interpreted as a requirement for a full Israeli withdrawal, but Netanyahu has made very clear that that's not how he sees it. And as I covered yesterday, he put out that statement saying, the IDF is going to stay in Gaza. So Hamas's long-standing position has been that it's willing to release all remaining Israeli captives in exchange for a full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. Hamas has also rejected the idea of disarming until the creation of a Palestinian state or a Palestinian force that could replace its armed wing. While many details need to be worked out, Trump and Netanyahu have framed the proposal as a final offer that must be accepted or Israel will finish the job. And Trump has made clear that he's willing to continue backing the genocidal war in Gaza if an agreement is not reached. He said, if Hamas rejects this, you have our full backing. And Trump said on Tuesday that he will give Hamas 3 or 4 days to respond to the proposal. He said, quote, all of the Arab countries are signed up. The Muslim countries all signed up. Israel's all signed up. We're just waiting for Hamas, and Hamas is either going to be doing it or not. And if it's not, it's going to be a very sad end, end quote. So he's claiming all the Arab countries are on board, even though they were angry about them releasing the one with Netanyahu's changes. So far, no response yet from Hamas. So the next one here, the Sumud Flotilla is on high alert as it nears Gaza amid Israeli threats. This article is from Al Jazeera. So these are live updates that they have. I wanted to post this just because I think this story, this could happen overnight. So they have some live updates here. Essentially, they're getting close to Gaza, and they are preparing to be intercepted by the Israeli Navy. And Israeli media says that they're planning to intercept them. And there's about 42, I believe, boats that are, on the move right now toward Gaza. So we'll see, it's something certainly to keep an eye on over the next day, the next few hours when, things could really go down soon. The latest live update they have is that there's a French MEP who's on the Gaza flotilla and says that a crew is preparing for interception. Israeli media reports that the Israeli Navy and commandos are preparing to intercept these boats. European MEP says Israeli military ship reportedly on its way to the Sumud flotilla. And this is one of the members of European Parliament who is on one of the boats. So, my hope is that Israel knows that, they're losing all support all around the world, and they have to know that if they start firing on these people and killing people from countries from all around the world, including politicians, that they're just gonna be completely isolated even more. I hope that hasn't had an impact on their conduct in Gaza, but let's see, they just had one more update here from Al Jazeera. So it's just kind of some facts about the flotilla. So there are 44 ships that are currently sailing with the fleet. 497 people are on there. As I understand it, there's 24 American citizens. Hopefully, the Italian Navy, there was reports that the Italian ship was basically saying, all right, we got you this far. See you later. We don't want to be near Gaza. And I think it was clear from the beginning that Italy and Spain, they were not saying that they're going to bring these boats into Gaza. They're basically saying that they're going to be around them if there needs to be any sort of rescue effort. And of course, you have Israel claiming that, this is Hamas, that the flotilla is Hamas, which, the implication there is that they could bomb them. All right. So the next one here, the IDF kills at least 64 more Palestinians across the Gaza Strip. So the relentless violence continues. Israeli forces killed at least 64 more Palestinians in the Gaza Strip on Tuesday, medical sources told WAFA, as the U.S.-backed genocidal war grinds on despite talk of a potential ceasefire deal. Among the dead were 18 Palestinians killed while attempting to reach aid. The Associated Press reported that 17 aid seekers were killed near the Netzarim corridor, an Israeli-controlled strip of land in central Gaza. According to Gaza's health ministry, since the end of May, at least 2,576 Palestinians have been killed while trying to get food. And as I mentioned in this story that there was that recent report from Haaretz where an Israeli sniper detailed killing unarmed Palestinian civilians, including children, who were attempting to get aid in northern Gaza. So the AP also reported that Israel bombed 2 tents in the Al-Mawasi tent camp in southern Gaza, the area where the IDF has ordered all Palestinian civilians in Gaza City to flee to, but they continue to bomb it. And one of the strikes killed 7 people, including 4 women and a child. And this was a family that fled Gaza City earlier this month. They did what the IDF told them to do. They went down to Al-Mawasi and they were bombed and killed, massacred. And then the other strike killed a man, his pregnant wife, and their young child. So again, genocide continues despite all this talk about a potential plan here. And we'll see. I mean, from what I'm seeing and hearing, the sentiment among the Palestinians suffering in Gaza is that they don't care what the deal is, what the plan is. They just need relief. They need aid. They need food. They need it to stop. They need the killing to stop and the starvation to stop. All right. So the next one here, federal judge says the push to deport critics of Israel is unconstitutional. So this is good news here, some rare good news. A federal judge in Boston ruled on Tuesday that the Trump administration violated the Constitution with its effort to deport critics of Israel and affirmed that non-citizens in the U.S. legally have the same right to free speech as Americans. So this is District Judge William Young, who was nominated by President Reagan. He said, quote, "This case, perhaps the most important ever to fall within the jurisdiction of this district court, squarely presents the issue whether non-citizens lawfully present here in the United States actually have the same free speech rights as the rest of us. This court answers this constitutional question unequivocally. Yes, they do," end quote. So the ruling was the result of a lawsuit brought by several university associations that alleged the arrest of college students and faculty who participated in pro-Palestine protests, violated the First Amendment, and had a chilling effect on speech. Janine Yunus, a civil liberties attorney, and she's the legal director of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. She told me, quote, in his 161-page opinion, the judge analyzed the Trump administration's allegations against several non-citizens, including Mahmoud Khalil and Rumasa Ozturk, and rightfully recognized that they were targeted purely for their political views and speech. He rejected the arguments that non-citizens lacked First Amendment protections, correctly observing that it serves as a restraint on government without respect to the immigration status of the speaker, end quote. So in his ruling, Young said that Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Homeland Security Kristi Noem and their subordinates acted in concert to misuse the sweeping powers of their respective offices to target non-citizen pro-Palestinians for deportation, primarily on account of their First Amendment protected political speech. And he also said that these actions continue to have a chilling effect on freedom on speech to this day, saying it's unconstitutional. And I mean, you look at the college campuses. I mean, I'm sure that there's protests happening, but not nearly at the level that they were before this big crackdown. All right, so the next one here, Israel is paying influencers $7,000 per post. So this article is from Nick Cleveland Stout at Responsible Statecraft. So he has learned that, according to documents that he has obtained, that influencers are likely being paid around $7,000 per post on social media, such as TikTok and Instagram, on behalf of Israel. Bridget Partners, a firm working for the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, sent a series of invoices for its influencer campaign to Havas Media Group Germany, an international media group working for Israel. The invoices detailed a sum of $900,000 starting in June and slated to end in November for a cohort of 14 to 18 influencers to create content. The document, which was filed under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, notes that the funding is both for payments for influencers and production, but does not provide a breakdown between the two. When taking into account the administrative production costs through September 16th, that leaves an estimated sum of $552,000 for influencers between June and September of this year. And the documents don't say who the influencers are who are getting paid this much money to post pro-Israel content. It's fun to speculate. I'm sure some of the ones that were brought to the GHF sites in Gaza, the ones that we've seen in Israel, maybe the ones Netanyahu was talking to over the weekend, could be getting some of this money. All right, so the next one here: no politically correct rules of engagement. So, U.S. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth said in an address to hundreds of thousands of generals and admirals on Tuesday that there should be no more what he called politically correct rules of engagement for the U.S. military, as he presented his recently rebranded Department of War as a ruthless force that can produce overwhelming violence. So this is what Hegseth said. I'm going to read kind of a bit of this. This whole speech was just crazy. So he said, quote, "We're training warriors, not defenders. We fight wars to win, not to defend. Defense is something you do all the time. It's inherently reactionary and can lead to overreach and mission creep. War is something you do sparingly. On our own terms and with clear aims, we fight to win. We unleash overwhelming and punishing violence on the enemy. We also don't fight with stupid rules of engagement. We untie the hands of our war fighters to intimidate, demoralize, hunt, and kill the enemies of our country. No more politically correct and overbearing rules of engagement. Just common sense, maximum lethality, and authority for war fighters," end quote. So, he's talking about rules of engagement here. One thing that happened after Trump came into office was that he eased restrictions on U.S. airstrikes and raids outside of war zones, which the only two countries, this might have changed, but at the time, the only two countries that were officially considered war zones for the U.S. military were Iraq and Syria. So as a result of this, we've seen the record airstrikes in Somalia, and we saw the U.S. military unleash a brutal bombing campaign on Yemen, which involved strikes on residential buildings, other civilian infrastructure, energy infrastructure, a fuel port where they killed over 80 civilian workers in a single bombing. And the bombing of the migrant detention facility that killed over 60 African migrants who were literally being held in jail. So that's the result of not following, rules of engagement. This is just kind of his narrative again, what he's saying here in this speech and what he says a lot is, he's like, it's limited, it's only limited when we wage war and we go in with a clear goal, we execute it, we achieve that goal, and we get out. And I've heard him in other talks or maybe comments to the media cite Yemen as one of these examples, but when it was a complete failure. He lost a war, which he called Operation Rough Rider. They were trying to get the Houthis or Ansar Allah to stop targeting Israel or stop the blockade on Israeli shipping, and they failed. Yet, he goes around all this tough talk when it's just, barbarism, essentially. If this bombing campaign in Yemen is his idea of waging war, then, he's no better than Netanyahu. So elsewhere in his speech on Tuesday, Hegseth said that his message to U.S. enemies was FAFO, a slang term that stands for F around and find out. So this is what he said, quote, Since waging war is so costly in blood and treasure, we owe our republic a military that will win any war we choose or any war that is thrust upon us. Should our enemies choose foolishly to challenge us, they will be crushed by the violence, precision, and ferocity of the War Department. In other words, to our enemies, FAFO, end quote. He actually spelled it out, F-A-F-O. I've always said it in my head, FAFO. It's a stupid, slang term. I often see people say it in comments, under posts about children being killed in Gaza. They, just sick people write FAFO under things like that. And President Trump also addressed the generals and admirals in Quantico who came from around the U.S. and across the world to attend the meeting. In his speech, Trump stressed that the U.S. military was expanding its role on the domestic front, saying that the U.S. was facing an invasion from within and that U.S. cities should be used as a training ground for U.S. troops. He said, quote, "We are under invasion from within, no different than a foreign enemy, but more difficult in many ways because they don't wear uniforms," end quote. So pretty ominous there what Trump was saying. So we'll get into that more in the next one. I still have so much to cover. I'm already 20 minutes into the show. I'm going to try to kind of rapid fire some of these stories. There's just so much going on. So the next one here, Trump rejects policing Somalia, but continues bombing the country. So President Trump on Tuesday rejected the idea that the U.S. military should police African countries like Somalia and Kenya, comments that come as he is overseeing the heaviest U.S. air campaign in Somalia in history. So Trump said, quote, and this is his speech to the generals, "We brought back the fundamental principle that defending the homeland is the military's first and most important priority. Only in recent decades did politicians somehow come to believe that our job is to police the far reaches of Kenya and Somalia, while America is under invasion," end quote. So on the same day, U.S. Africa Command announced it launched an airstrike in Somalia's northeastern Puntland region that it said targeted the local ISIS affiliate. So is bombing a country policing, or is that different? The bombing brings the total number of U.S. airstrikes in Somalia so far this year to 80, as the administration has shattered the record for annual airstrikes in the country, which Trump set at 63 during his first term in 2019. For context, someone emailed me recently and said it would be good to mention the numbers of airstrikes in Somalia in previous administrations for the context. And I think that was a very good suggestion, because this really goes to show how unprecedented this U.S. bombing campaign is in Somalia that gets literally no media coverage in the U.S. I know I always say that, but to me, it's just really crazy to me. So for context, Trump has launched 80 airstrikes in Somalia so far this year, according to AFRICOM. President Biden launched 51 strikes in Somalia throughout his entire 4-year term. And this is according to numbers from New America, which is an organization that tracks the U.S. air war in Somalia. President Obama launched 48 strikes in Somalia throughout his 8 years in office. And George W. Bush launched 12. And during his first term, Trump launched 219. So you see Trump is he's bombed the country way more than any other president. And he's on track to really blow his first term numbers out of the water if they continue at this pace throughout the rest of his presidency. And I mentioned here again kind of the loosening the rules of engagement, the restrictions to which led to this huge increase in airstrikes. Trump probably isn't aware. I would guess that he is not aware that he's broken the record for U.S. airstrikes in Somalia this year. I think he just signed off on it and said, AFRICOM, do your thing, and that was that. All right, so the next one here, IDF raids villages in Syria's Quneitra and Daraa. So this article is from Jason Ditz. So Israeli ground troops continue to operate in southwestern Syria, carrying out raids against villages in both the Daraa and Quneitra governance. This comes amid ongoing talks between Syria and Israel trying to reduce tensions. On Sunday, Israeli troops and armored vehicles raided the village of Saida, forcing their way into civilian homes and carrying out searches, and unusually enough, trying to force villagers to answer surveys before ultimately withdrawing. So this is kind of a common thing in these villages in southwestern Syria, that Israeli troops will come in, they'll detain some people, question them, let them go, and then, they might confiscate some things or whatever. But this is, they're living under essentially an Israeli occupation now. in these villages where they can just kind of come and go as they please. All right, so the next one here, Damascus orders troops to prepare for operations against the SDF. So this article is from the Cradle. So Syria's government has asked factions within the military to prepare for operations against the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights has reported. So according to the observatory, Turkish-aligned factions in the Syrian army were asked to prepare for operations against the SDF in Deir Hafir and the Tishreen Dam area. There were some pretty big battles here, ongoing when the regime change happened, and in the weeks and months after it, the tensions did cool. But now, essentially, this is over. The SDF doesn't want to give up its weapons, doesn't want to integrate with this new government. They want to be, remain autonomous, but not. They're saying they don't want secession. They just want a degree of autonomy. But the HTS doesn't want that. Turkey doesn't want that, which is HTS's biggest backer. So there's been other reports that they're preparing for an invasion here. This could lead to a very, very big battles, very big war within Syria if this goes down. All right, so the next one here, Lavrov doubts that the U.S. will give Ukraine Tomahawks. So Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said on Tuesday that he does not believe the Trump administration has made a final decision on the possibility of providing Ukraine with Tomahawk missiles, and that he would be surprised if the U.S. went through with the idea. I thought it was interesting what Lavrov said here, but we haven't seen any kind of hysterical reaction from the Russians about this talk of the U.S. potentially providing Tomahawk missiles, even though it is it would be just a huge escalation because they have such a long range. It would be a big deal. But this is what Lavrov said. He said, quote, "I think this is primarily the result of European pressure on Washington, and Washington wants to show that it takes into account the opinions of its allies. I don't think we have seen the final decision. The Americans don't supply Tomahawks to everyone. Among Europeans, if I'm not mistaken, they supply them to Spain and the Netherlands. They're somewhat wary of the rest. If they believe that Ukraine is a responsible nation that will use them responsibly, that would be surprising to me," end quote. And so the point he's making is that they don't sell these missiles to all. The U.S. doesn't give these missiles to all of its allies. So he's saying it'd be surprising if they end up giving them to Ukraine, considering that fact. All right, so the next one here, Poland arrests man allegedly involved in Nord Stream bombing. So this one's from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. So a second man was arrested for his alleged role in the Nord Stream pipeline bombing that occurred in September 2022. And Kyle mentions the kind of competing narratives about this bombing. The Seymour Hersh report says that President Biden ordered the bombing. And then after that, kind of the story that came from the mainstream U.S. press was that it goes back to Ukraine. But, when it first happened, you had all these people claiming it was Russia, which didn't make sense because it was their own pipeline. But anyway, so this is the second man who's been arrested, Ukrainian, over an alleged role in this. And the funniest thing is that he was identified as Volodymyr Z, the same initial as the Ukrainian president. But I just think, essentially, it's either Biden ordered the bombing or the official narrative now is that it was Ukraine. And I'm sure if Ukraine pulled it off, they certainly had help. All right, so the next one here, Boeing to replace U.S. bombs dropped on Iran. So Boeing is set to receive a contract worth up to $123 million to replace the massive 30,000-pound bunker-busting bombs that the U.S. dropped on Iranian nuclear facilities in June as part of the 12-day U.S.-Israeli war against Iran. And this was reported by Bloomberg on Tuesday. So on June 22nd, U.S. B-2 Spirit bombers dropped 14 GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator bombs on Iran's Fordo and Natanz nuclear sites, marking the first time the weapon was used in combat. A U.S. submarine also fired Tomahawk missiles in strikes on an Iranian nuclear facility in Isfahan. The attack, dubbed Operation Midnight Hammer, was launched on behalf of Israel. The Bloomberg report said that a Pentagon budget document from August says that funds are being shifted from operations and maintenance accounts to Air Force munitions procurement, as funds are required to replace the GBU-57 munitions expended in Operation Midnight Hammer in support of Israel. And that was the language in the Pentagon document. This picture here is when Netanyahu visited the White House, visited the U.S. in July, and met with Hegseth at the Pentagon. And Hegseth presented him with this nice framed picture of a B-2 bomber and the Operation Midnight Hammer sketch of the attack or whatever that is. Again, just really shameful stuff here. So replacing these bombs is just a fraction of the cost of the war against Iran, as the U.S. used a significant number of interceptors to defend Israel throughout the 12 days. U.S. officials told the Wall Street Journal that the U.S. fired more than 150 THAAD interceptors during the war, accounting for about 1/4 of the Pentagon's total stock of the interceptors, and that alone costs about $2 billion. There's also the Patriot missiles used to repel the attack on the base in Qatar, which was Iran's response to the U.S. bombing its nuclear sites. And all indications now are that there's going to be another, potential war here against Iran. So even, as Hegseth says, we go in and we finish the job. Well, it doesn't seem like this war is really over yet. All right, so the next one here, North Korea tells the UN that it won't give up its nukes. This is another one from Kyle. So in an address to the UN General Assembly, a top North Korean official explained that Pyongyang will never agree to give up its nuclear weapons. The U.S. has demanded that denuclearization be part of any agreement with North Korea. Although what's interesting is that Kim recently said that if the U.S. drops denuclearization, he'd be open to talks. So I'm hoping that leads to some kind of diplomacy between the U.S. and North Korea. Although we did learn recently that when Trump was talking to Kim last time, he also signed off on a U.S. Navy SEAL raid in North Korea that ended with North Korean fishermen being killed. But anyway, not a surprise. So North Korea's Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs addressed the UN and said, quote, "The imposition of denuclearization on the DPRK is tantamount to demanding it to surrender sovereignty and right to exist and violate the Constitution. We will never give up nuclear, which is our state law, national policy, and sovereign power, as well as the right to existence. Under any circumstances, we will never walk away from this position," end quote. And considering, what's happened with Iran and, it can't be surprised by this. All right, so the next one here, the last story, the UN approves ramping up U.S.-sponsored force in Haiti. Another one from Kyle. So the UN Security Council voted to drastically increase the Kenyan-led military operations in Haiti. Washington pushed for a UN force to deploy to Haiti to take control from gangs and hand it back to the U.S.-backed Haitian government. On Tuesday, the Security Council approved expanding the multinational security mission to 5,500 troops. The U.S. and Panama sponsored the resolution. 12 members of the Security Council voted to expand the force, while Russia, China, and Pakistan abstained. So let's see. The Security Council initially approved a force of 1,500 troops, and Kenyan soldiers began arriving in Haiti in 2024. And one thing that's been happening is there's been this drone campaign going on here, and there's been reports that American mercenaries are involved, that Eric Prince might be involved to some extent. And earlier this month, a drone strike by the Haitian government anti-gang task force killed 11 civilians, including 8 children. And this is something, again, that the U.S. is backing, is involved with. Something I've been meaning to cover more, but there's just so much happening. So that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our Viewpoints, one from Ted Snyder. Why were there Russian drones over Poland? One from Judge Napolitano, free speech and its discontents. One from Shai Grunberg, this Yom Kippur, there will be no forgiveness for Israel's transgressions in Gaza. One from Thomas Knapp, National Defense Strategy, a novel and unlikely but welcome proposition. Our spotlight from George O'Neill, the normalization of assassination. So please go check out our page. Lots of other stuff in the lower part and over in our blog, and just lots of stuff to check out, even if you watch the show. And please like, subscribe, comment, all that stuff that I tell you. Follow us on social media. I think that's it. Hopefully there's not some horrible news tomorrow about the Gaza flotilla. We'll definitely be keeping a close eye on that. But anyway, that is it for me for today. Thanks for listening.